This is the Spirit and Wellness Show. News and information from a higher perspective. With your host, Harry Wilkinson. And this is the show where we take a look at the days and weeks events, happenings in the world of politics, entertainment, news in general, and we take a look at it from a higher perspective, a spiritual perspective, if you will. And it's a way of taking a step back from all of the hectic goings on and all of the the assault of the media that we get, which more and more is not particularly escapable, if that's a word. But, what I find is that in looking at these stories that we are telling about ourselves, situations that we are creating, we learn from them. We learn from them. From the spiritual perspective that I'm talking about, from the higher perspective that I'm talking about how we are all connected, how we are all one. And that what we experience on this plane of existence, of this, our everyday mundane life, what we are experiencing or going through are actually our own creations, but we don't recognize them as such because they are our creations at a much higher level of our being than we are normally aware of in our everyday life. And we do this in a way to almost play a game with ourselves, to experience that which we really are not, and in so doing reconnect with the truth of who and what we really are, which is oneness, divine mind, all of those things. So that's a brief sketch of my point of view. If you've never heard the show before, I talk about a variety of issues. This is not a religious show, but I do talk about religion. I will talk about it today a little bit. But today we're also going to be talking about synchronicity. You may have noticed that was the title of this episode of the show. We're going to talk about synchronicity, what that is, what it means, and how we create that in our lives and how we may look at it a little differently and benefit from it. And we're going to continue our discussion, which we really started last week, when we said that the world is actually not on fire, as Ted Cruz was telling a 3-year-old in one of his speeches, but in fact that the world has quite a bit of exciting, new, and very positive things going on, which you might not have heard of because it may have been buried underneath the loud clashing sounds of the trumpets of the latest deaths, wars, etc., and so forth. So we're going to talk about some good news about poverty in the developing world and ending that. It's possible, the experts say. So we're going to talk about that. But first, it is for those of you who are who celebrate Easter. For those of you who are Christians or Catholics, it is Palm Sunday. So we'll talk a little bit about Palm Sunday and what that means for those who don't really know what that is all about. So Palm Sunday is part of the story of Jesus. It's part of what is often referred to as the Passion, or the Passion of the Christ, as you may recall the motion picture a few years back that came out. But Passion plays have uh, been a staple of entertainment and theater for centuries, since the death of Jesus himself. Uh, Passion plays are simply reenactments of Jesus' last days. And so Palm Sunday is an important part of that story. Uh, Palm Sunday is the day that the canonical Gospels, those are the traditional Gospels, Mark and Luke and Matthew and John. Those Gospels, according to them, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, greeted by cheers of celebrating people, of his followers, who laid down cloaks in front of him and small branches, palms. There's a lot of symbolism involved, as with so many of the stories of Jesus, and they come from traditions that predate even the events that the story is telling. They kind of infuse very familiar symbols that people would have known into the story of Jesus, to relate it to people who are perhaps steeped in another tradition, or were steeped in another tradition. This is a lot of where much of the storytelling around Jesus' life comes from. It's an awful lot of symbolism. So the donkey is a symbol. Donkey is a symbol of, well, in the Eastern tradition, apparently, the donkey is an animal of peace. And that versus the horse, which is an animal of war. That was a way that was very common for kings, which Jesus is considered to be at this point in his life. He's a spiritual king. And he's riding in on a donkey, which is the animal of peace, rather than a horse, which is the animal of war. And that is possibly a symbol of him presenting himself as the Prince of Peace, rather than a war-waging king. There were two sort of expectations of Jesus. And one of them was that he was to be the Messiah. And a lot of the expectation around the Messiah, which was this figure that in Judaism was supposed to come and righteously, right all wrongs. And the idea of the Messiah, and a lot of the expectation of Jesus as Messiah, was that he would be a warrior king, that he would attack the political structure of Rome, that the Jews of the time found oppressive, and that he would liberate them, basically. The Messiah is supposed to be coming as a liberator, and many interpreted that as a liberator physically, a liberator from conditions of oppression. Whereas what Jesus really appears to have done is to be a liberator of spirit. So in that, there was the disappointment in Jesus not doing what was thought he ought to do, which was to, liberate the Jewish people from oppression. And that is really the beginning, the seeds of the discontent over Jesus' ministry by the traditional Jewish people, and resulted in them, actually throwing him to the wolves, if you will, and allowing him to be crucified. So there was that, all of that going on, in the subtext of all of that, in a political way, in the historical sense of Jesus, which is what I'm talking about. But in Jewish tradition, apparently, the telling of these stories has a certain way that it goes. Certain symbols are used, and so the donkey and the palms play a big part of that. The palms themselves were supposed to be symbols of triumph and victory. That comes from Greco-Roman culture. And so he, coming with, having palms laid in his path, or coming with palms, symboled his triumphing. And in a way, it sort of was echoing, or perhaps the Romans probably took it as rather a mocking of their traditions, which also may have set up the discontent that led to Jesus' crucifixion. But anyway, so that's a little bit about what the symbols of Palm Sunday mean, and there are apparently customs around the world of how this is celebrated. Some, like in Belgium, there are processions, marches that take place, where a fellowship of 12 apostles carries a wooden statue of Christ around the town, while the children go to door to door offering the palms for coins. In India, flowers are strewn about into the sanctuary on Palm Sunday during the reading of the gospel. At the words uttered by the crowd welcoming Jesus, Hosanna, blessed is he who come and is to come in the name of the Lord God. In Italy, the palm leaves are used with olive branches, placed at the entrances of houses. Where else do we have here? In Malta, all the parishes on Palm Sunday bless the palm leaves and the olive leaves. And in the Netherlands, crosses are decorated with candy and bread made in the form of a rooster. A great procession with oil lamps is held the night before Palm Sunday in honor of the event. So, quite a lot of different versions of how this is celebrated. But so there's a little information about Palm Sunday for you. On we go. Now, we're talking about how the world is not on fire, but indeed is getting better every day. So this article, coming from BBC News, is all about the possibility of ending global poverty, which is something that the UN is expected to adopt. The World Bank already has the target of ending extreme poverty by 2030, which is in 15 years. And the UN is expected to adopt that target date. So the article asked the question, what would it take and can we really do it? And there's been a great deal of progress already, according to this article. The poverty rate in the developing world has more than halved since 1981. In 1981, 52% of people in developing countries lived on less than $1 a day. That's now dropped to 15%, from 50 to 15% of people living on less than $1 a day. In terms of the UN's development goals, Millennium Development Goals, it meant that the target of halving poverty by 2015 from 1990 levels was achieved 5 years earlier. In 1990, more than a third of the world's population lived in abject poverty, and that was halved to 18% in 2010. So in just that period of 20 years, that is halved. And the article goes on to say that this is largely due to China. And there are still about 1 billion people who live in extreme poverty. China's economic growth has been a big factor, apparently, in the reduction of poverty rates. Sub-Saharan Africa is the only region where the number of poor people has increased during the past 3 decades. Even though the percentage of the African population living in extremely poverty is slightly lower than in 1981, population growth means that the number of people has actually doubled. So Africa is having a surge in population growth. Which changes the poverty statistics there. So they account for more than 1/3 of the poor in the world. And they only make up 11% of the global population. Only 11% of the population on the planet live in Africa, but they account for more than 1/3 of the poor in the world. In East Asia, 4 out of 5 people, or 80%, lived in poverty in 1981, and now that rate has dropped to 8%. So again, that has much to do with China. The World Bank projects that it's possible to end extreme poverty by 2030, but it will take a heroic effort. The number of people in poverty will have to decrease by 50 million each year, and that's the equivalent of about 1 million people each week for the next 15 years. World Bank President Jim Young Kim felt that was possible, but it would require funding and lots of policies from countries internationally to raise incomes and productivity. Apparently, the UK commits 7% of their GDP to development, and that is something that they are not cutting back on, apparently. Sorry for the delay there. I was just looking at some of these statistics. So basically, reducing poverty, according to what their goals, in this are, means that a 30% poverty rate is equivalent to the end of poverty, since there will be some who move in and out of poverty, for example, when they lose their jobs. So there will always be some frictional poverty. That's the term they use, frictional poverty. So even so, the task of reducing poverty at that pace is so daunting that economists forecast the global poverty rate is likely to be 8% in 2030. That works out to be about 664 million people still living in poverty out of an estimated 8.3 billion on the planet. But that's still amazing. So much of it has to do with economic growth. But if that economic growth doesn't continue, then that may change the whole landscape entirely. But so the African focus on this is something that is drawing quite a bit of debate, since Africa seems to be suffering the most. They are the second fastest growing region in the world, but they have not seen falls in the number of poor. Uh, and so there are those that believe that there needs to be an overhaul of the way that the aid that is getting to those countries is used, and sometimes the aid doesn't even get there. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but the fact that we are making this kind of progress and that people are focused on this as a goal is truly remarkable. And you know, something that I didn't hear that on the news at all. Most of what I heard on the news this week, and I'm sure this is the case for you as well, had to do with the crashing of that plane. And, we talk about, on the show, we talk about tragedies of that nature and what they mean to us from a spiritual perspective. How the creation of an event like that, the enacting of an event like that, the emotions that it brings to the fore, and the connections that it brings out, are ways of galvanizing ourselves together in a way. But I don't want to talk about that this time around. Uh, what I want to talk about is the fact that for days, particularly on BBC, but on the other, many of the other news channels, all the coverage was on this plane. Everything was pointed at one story. And this is kind of the thing that is difficult for people to understand. Not that it was not an important story. Of course it was an important story. And of course there was, ongoing information being revealed, and some of it quite startling, finding out that the pilot locked the other pilot out of the cockpit and all of that kind of stuff, and was responsible for crashing the plane. It's very dramatic, and that captures everybody's attention. However, as a service, news is supposed to be provided, and someone in these organizations decided that there was no important news to talk about other than this plane crash. And it really is quite exemplary of how we don't get information that we really should be getting. That's number one. And number two, how these stories are just that, stories. As I say, we create them for a reason, and we learn from them, and not to turn away from them. But also, you have to know when to seek out more. And we have the tools in this day and age to do just that. We have the tools to go into a story, not only that, but to find other stories that we're not hearing about. And that is more and more our charge now. The news media used to be a service provided to the nation, that provided important information. It no longer serves that purpose as much as it serves as a form of entertainment. So it is incumbent upon everybody now to use the tools of the internet, use the tools of the Web 2.0 to find out the information that you need to find out. Anyway, I don't want to linger on that one. We'll talk about that more another time. So we're going to talk about synchronicity for the rest of the show here. That's the big theme. And there's a nice article here in unknowncountry.com. That's Whitley Strieber's website. And It's called Weekend. It's called When the Unlikely and the Unbelievable Collide. In the aftermath of an early morning UFO encounter in his backyard that ended with both he and his wife losing consciousness, Charles Fontaine was haunted by a series of strange coincidences and paranormal experiences. Even though he rarely read books outside of his field in aeronautics, he went to a bookstore in Montreal Mall and picked up one book, the French edition of The 7 Secrets of Synchronicity. And he began reading it at home. And as he reached the second chapter, he Googled the phrase synchronicity and UFOs. And that led him right into another synchronicity, an image on a blog that showed a hovering UFO beaming light to the ground similar to what he had experienced. Looking more closely, he realized he was on a synchronicity blog written by the authors of the book he was reading. And that's when he knew he had to contact the authors, and that was how Charles Fontaine became a central figure in this book that these authors, Trish and Rob McGregor, had written, called Aliens in the Backyard, UFOs, Abductions, and Synchronicity. So synchronicity is a term that was coined by Carl Jung in 1949. And basically it's a meaningful coincidence, as Jung defined it, the coming together of inner and outer events in a way that's meaningful to the person who experiences it and can't be explained by cause and effect. So, it's when you're thinking of your friend and they call, and you haven't seen them in years. And there's, of course, a lot more powerful examples of that. But this article takes a look at what this might be and in our lives. And what they say is it seems to exist along the border of what quantum physicist David Bohm called the implicate or enfolded order of existence and the explicate order, what we perceive in our daily lives. It may be our most direct experience of who we are as individuals, as a species, and as a human collective. It manifests itself at juncture points in our lives: birth, death, marriage, divorce, move, change in financial status and illness, any transitional point. And it's sometimes a wake-up call that shakes us out of our established routines and rigid ways of thinking. Sometimes there's a trickster component to it, where the universe seems to be poking fun at us, laughing at us, doing a gotcha. So this article suggests that paranormal is often involved in synchronicity. So synchronistic events can have things involved in it, like telepathy, remote viewing, precognition, telekinesis, and time displacement. Sometimes it can be a matter of, as they're saying, occurring in clusters where the same songs, numbers, books, names, objects, or places occur repeatedly in a matter of hours or days. Jung believed that this meant an archetype had become active in your unconscious and would continue until you got the message. And it often occurs in heightened periods of creativity. So, that happens when, several writers might come up with the same storyline, or inventors invent the same thing. And we talked about that not last week, but a few weeks ago, about the number of inventions, and particularly life-changing inventions, that were invented by two different people at the same time. One ended up getting credit for it, and the other did not. So there's a lot of that when you look at it is really quite head-scratchingly interesting. Pardon me. Sometimes it appears in mass events like the marathon bombing, 9/11, or even this plane crash that has been dominating the news, or the disappearance of the Malaysian flight, which we've talked about. Again, there's a trickster element involved. and in-your-face component that's hard to ignore. What manifests itself in tragedies the media seizes upon, synchronicity is often embedded somewhere in the storyline. So there may be some synchronicity involved in that plane crash, which is why we are kind of obsessed with it and trying to shake out where that might be. They're not all big ones. Some are smaller ones. They are comforting allies in our journey through life. Animals can be messengers. The thing about synchronicity, according to the article, is that the sky is the limit, and the only thing holding us back is how willing we are to expand our consciousness. Synchronicity is an equal opportunity experiencer. It doesn't care about your social or financial status, religious or political beliefs, skin color, age, gender, and it doesn't even care if you're a die-hard skeptic. It happens, and whether you acknowledge it or not is the key. So that's an interesting way to look at synchronicity and how it affects our lives. There's another article here on ways to actually cultivate synchronicity and begin to become more aware of it. So in our next show, we are going to follow up on our synchronicity cause and look at those 7 ways to amplify it. But for now, our time has come to an end, so